Welcome, and thank you for joining us for tonight's CRO Career Conversations. My name is Vivian Doling, and I serve as Vice President of Emerging Company Development at the North Carolina Biotechnology Center and co-lead our North Carolina CRO Collaborative with my colleague, Laura Raleigh. While North Carolina is a leader in clinical research, career opportunities in the field remain elusive to many. Through this event series, we are inviting professionals from the CRO industry and research sites to speak candidly about their own experiences and provide more information about the many rewarding career opportunities that exist. We recommend using Zoom Gallery View during tonight's conversation to allow you to see all of our speakers. While attendees are muted to avoid potential disruptions, we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function. There is also the option to upvote questions. If you see someone else submit a question that you're curious about, give it a thumbs up. We will be devoting the last 20 minutes to answer your questions, and we will prioritize those with the most likes. Without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Holly Hugh, who is the Director of Office of Physician Scientist Development at the Duke University School of Medicine. Holly will introduce herself and kick off tonight's discussion on transitioning your advanced degree to a career in clinical research. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you, Vivian, very much. We welcome all of you here, and we're very happy to be doing this session for you. I think I speak for all panelists when I say that we probably all wish that someone had done this for us when we had been looking for jobs. When I finished my doctorate many moons ago, I sort of fell into clinical research. So hopefully we can provide some nuggets of wisdom to help you find your path. So Vivian, would you mind sharing the first slide? We thought we would offer you all a handful of slides with some areas for jobs and some job titles that might help you know what exists and what's out there in this field. Please know that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, but we are recording this session. So if you want to go back and take a look at these slides, you can do that at any time. So a few job categories and job titles that are common to both contract research organizations or CROs and academic institutions are research operations, or typically those people that keep the wheels moving, regulatory affairs, or those folks that typically keep everybody in line and following the rules. And we also have medical writing and data management, which are common to both. Next slide, please. Thank you. A few jobs that you might not think of immediately in clinical research. One of those is finance for people that may have an expertise here. We always need people to keep us on budget when we're conducting research. Training is another one, particularly even training for staff and keeping people up on the latest in clinical research. I know at Duke, in the department that I used to work in, we had an education coordinator that provided not only training for people, but created online modules. So if you enjoy something like that, that might be a job that interests you. Next slide, please. So some jobs that are maybe more specific to CROs, and I will say here that there are quite a few jobs where the job titles might be slightly different, but the job will be very similar. So some jobs that are specific to CROs might be medical affairs, pharmacokineticists for people that are trained with Pharm Ds, epidemiologists. We have a regulatory person on the panel that you'll meet soon who is gracious enough to provide a list of fellowship programs, and we can talk a little more about that later. Next slide, please. At Duke, We have clinical research units for most departments in the School of Medicine, or CRUs. Those CRUs provide startup for research, clinical research in those departments, and there are jobs available there. We have and program managers and directors. We also have a specific department, which is the Duke Office for Clinical Research, that was created just for the purpose of supporting clinical research in the schools of medicine and nursing. Next slide, please. At UNC Chapel Hill, the job categories and job titles are very similar. What's probably unique here is the multi-center manager job title, as well as clinical development. And one of our panelists is at UNC if you have any questions in that regard. UNC also has collaborative efforts with the pharmaceutical industry for fellowships in drug development, drug safety, medical affairs, and pharmacokinetics. And you can visit the pharmacy school if you have any website, if you have any interest in those. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn this over to our panelist, Michelle, who can talk about resources. Michelle, if you'll introduce yourself, and then I'll hand it to you.
Sure. Thank you, Holly. My name is Michelle North, and I have a Ph.D. in biochemistry from The Ohio State University. After a career in academic research in which I followed the typical path of completing my Ph.D., postdocing, and then managing an academic research lab, I felt that it was time for a career transition. But what exactly was that career transition going to be, and what was that going to look like? So one of the best things that I did was become actively involved within my community. Within RTP itself, there's a multitude of networking resources which one can tap into. And now, because of technology, we have a lot of Zoom meetings that seem to happen. You can tap into these networking opportunities just via Zoom. And I would encourage that, because you don't necessarily need to live within the RTP area. So one of the first things that I did was kind of figure out exactly what I wanted my career option to be, as opposed to straight bench research. And I was involved in a program through Dress for Success called Going Places Networking, just designed for women. And they had me go through the Strength Finders assessment, which gave me an idea of what my strengths were and what I would be really good at. In addition, I'm also a member of AAAS, the Association for the Advancement of Science. And they have a science career page, which identifies my IDP, or my independent developmental plan, which also provides me with ideas of how to move forward. And then I read this great book that I found at a bookstore for $1 by Poe Bronson called What Should I Do With My Life? And it's just these short stories. There's a short story in there where this guy graduated from Harvard Law School and decided that he did not want to be a lawyer, but opened up a bakery, a very successful bakery. And in the meantime, he opens his back door open 2 nights a week to provide free and sound attorney counseling. So as far as networking is concerned, we do have here in RTP, we have the North Carolina Biotech Jobs Networking Group. That site is provided there. You can also upload your resume to that site. And if you're new to the area or looking for a transition, this is one place that you definitely will go to for jobs. We have several other in-person events, Triangle Biotech Tuesday, the North Carolina Biopharma Networking Group. I'm also involved in Women in Biology, which is also a nationwide type of organization. And then just to make that transition into a CRO, remember, within RTP, there's approximately 150 CROs at this time, and quite a few big ones, quite a few small ones. And I always say that there's job security in disease. And the big $1 million question is always, how do I get my foot in the door? And I realized that when I left the academic research lab, I had no experience and no education in clinical trials. So Durham Tech offers an online program called the Clinical Trials Research Associate Program. They also have a medical product and safety pharmacovigilance program. Both of those programs come with internships, which I think are incredibly valuable for making that transition. The North Carolina Biotech Center also sponsors an RTP Bio, which is a collaboration between Wake Tech and Durham Tech. Now, that's not necessarily for a transition to a CRO, but there is a huge amount of pharma manufacturing which occurs within RTP who are looking for scientists. And lastly, NCCU also offers an online program called the Clinical Research Science Program. So those are some of the options and ideas that I can give moving forward.
Thank you, Michelle. Those are great resources. So let's introduce our two other panelists. So Mac, if you would turn on your camera and introduce yourself, talk about your degree and your background.
Yeah, my name is Mac Robinson. I'm Director of Clinical Development at UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. And so what I do there is I lead a team of individuals, including developers, more or less writers, and help investigators develop their clinical trials in cancer research. I started out, thinking I was going to be a bench scientist as well, and ended up diverting course a bit. And writing was sort of I don't want to say second passion, but it was certainly one of them, up there pretty high. I'm a big believer in science communication, and happened to run into a position at Wake Forest in their Comprehensive Cancer Center, writing protocols and grants. And so that was my first foray into clinical research.
Great, thank you. And Paulina, if you would introduce yourself and talk about your background a little bit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paulina McAtee, and I'm a Director of Business Information at PPD, now known as Thermo Fisher Scientific's Clinical Research Group. My background is that of a pharmacist. I was one of those undecided individuals after finishing my undergraduate degree in biological sciences, and I took a gap year and fell into a position as a clinical coordinator at the University of New Mexico Clinical Trials Center. That was my first experience with clinical research, and I did anything and everything from patient recruitment, enrollment, day-to-day visits, blood draws, EKGs, you name it, and served as a liaison between the university and the principal investigator, the patient, and the sponsor. One of the individuals that I interacted with on a regular basis was a research pharmacist. So that got me thinking about a field in pharmacy, and I ended up pursuing a degree in pharmacy and got my Pharm D. I was initially set on academia and staying in bench research. So I was in the Pharm D Ph.D. program, and then throughout pharmacy school, experienced, learned more about the industry. There aren't a lot of industry opportunities in Texas, at least there weren't back then. It was always East Coast, West Coast. But I found that PPD's Phase 1 clinic in Austin and set up a 6-week rotation there. And that just reaffirmed my interest in clinical research and led me to pursue the drug development fellowship through UNC and PPD.
That's great. And I can offer too, I didn't say this up front, but I can also offer that I started out after I finished my doctorate in a program manager position, actually at UNC, UC San Francisco. I was living in California at the time. And I did that for a while. And there was a time 10 or 15 years ago where I was out of the workforce entirely for almost a year, caring for my mom who passed, and then cared for my dad for a while. And it took me a little bit to get back into the field once I was completely out of it. And the panelists had this discussion earlier this week, but I would encourage you to utilize temporary services, because that actually got me into Duke. I started out, I was looking for, a program manager position or something on that level when I went back into the workforce. And it took me a little while to find something, but I finally found a temporary job that only lasted 2 or 3 months, but it got me in the door. And that was what I needed. So let's talk now. I think everybody addressed this. Let's talk about the application and interview process. So if any of you are hiring other people, what does that look like? So Michelle, do you want to start with that discussion?
Sure. The application interview process. I will just be incredibly transparent and let everybody know that while I was making this transition, I went through a ton of interviews. I knew that my resume looked good because I had a bunch of people look at it. And remember, when you're making this transition, when you have an advanced degree, you want to use a resume. Do not use a CV, and make it in the STAR format: situation, task, action, resolution. Like, what did you do for this department? Well, I designed this program which increased efficiency by 85%, and now people can keep track of their QC auditing or that type of thing. So that's a prime example of that. Keep it limited to 2 minutes. When you're making that transition from academia to industry, it's a much different game. People don't care that you won best abstract for the spring conference at the Ohio State University in biochemistry. It's great, but this is something different now. The other thing, as far as interviewing is concerned, there was a lot of times, there was probably 3 jobs which I went through the interview process. It was a screening phone call, then an interview with a member of the team. There may or may not be a test involved. I know for one position, I had to take a written test utilizing what I knew about clinical trials, such as utilizing ct.gov, what's an IMPD, what is a brochure, what is a packaging information, a lot of drug and FDA regulations, et cetera. So you might encounter that. I do want to let people know that for the most part, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 interviews, they were very pleasant. I just, couldn't stick the landing at times, which was disappointing, but there's probably a reason for that, and I will just continue to push forward. But I do want to let you know that the 3 really awful interviews I had seemed incredibly hostile. And keep that in mind, because that is a reflection of the organization you may or may not be asked to join. It's not an FBI interrogation, and I am not Kaiser Sose. So I keep that in mind when I interact with people. And you have to realize that the world of clinical trials, as large as it is incredibly small. And those types of negative interactions with interviews do get around, and they stick with you. So there's a list of, well, not a list, but there's 2 or 3 companies that I refuse to ever apply for, because what's the point? I probably wouldn't be a good fit there, and I don't have time or energy to waste for that. So that's my advice.
Thank you, Michelle. And Mac, do you have anything to add to that might come from an academic perspective?
Yeah, I was just thinking, most of my interactions have been pretty pleasant. I have interviewed with one industry entity, and it was all pretty much the same. It was all typically present. Now, I was interviewing for writing positions, and there's always a test at some juncture. At some point, you're sitting down and you're writing something. But yeah, I've found them to be pretty pleasant. Expect a day, or at least a good chunk of a day to devote to it. But
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Great. And Paulina, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I would, especially trying to make the shift into industry without a prior background, I would approach it kind of as a multimodal approach. So number one, I cannot overemphasize the importance of networking. I think that's been mentioned already, but again, as Michelle said, the industry world is small, and most of you are in North Carolina. There are plenty of opportunities to get involved in different organizations, and the more you do so, attend meetings, hopefully some face-to-face interactions, you'll start to see the same names over and over again. So take advantage of those networking opportunities. Stay well informed as well. Check out some publications that are available, whether it's through the FDA, there's a lot of updates that are provided, or the Fierce Biotech CRO Pharma series provides great updates. So you can see what the industry trends are, and especially how the companies that you're applying for fit within those industry trends. So you'll see what's going on with COVID treatment development, the introduction and the absolute explosion of decentralized clinical trial solutions. So you can start to tailor some of the skill sets that you have to those industry needs, and also look at potential opportunities to maybe expand your skill set as well. As Michelle said, be concise with your resume. It can be often a little demoralizing when you hear some of the statistics, but it's true that when your resume comes through, nobody's spending more than a minute on that initial review of your resume. So the more concise you can be in terms of your accomplishments and what impact you've had, the better. And just be prepared. Interviews are typically pretty similar in format and nature, so be familiar with the company, with the role, with some of the industry acronyms and kind of roles and definitions, and be prepared for behavioral types of interview questions as well. That's something, again, following that STAR method that you'll see. So I think that's all that I had to add.
Yeah, thank you, Paulina. And while you're talking, if you wouldn't mind, let's touch on fellowship programs for a moment. And I think you've had experience with that and went through a fellowship program. Would you mind letting viewers know about that and your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship program through UNC and PPD, and I can quite honestly say that I would not be in the position that I'm currently at without that experience, because it's often that chicken or the egg scenario where you look at job postings and experience is required, but then it's impossible to figure out how to get that experience. And my fellowship program, which still exists, and UNC has expanded the available fellowship programs to include not only the clinical research and drug development fellowship that I completed, but there's also partnerships with other CRO and pharma companies, and also fellowships that focus on specific areas, such as medical affairs, regulatory affairs, pharmacokinetics, et cetera. My fellowship was broader in nature. I spent 6 months at UNC Chapel Hill looking at the Lineberger Cancer Center, seeing how trials are run within an academic institution. And then the year and a half that I had remaining was kind of like speed dating, but in an industry setting. So I'd have maybe 6 to 8 week rotations in various departments, and had the opportunity to experience anything from project management to medical writing, see individuals with my education and background in positions that I didn't even know existed, and had the opportunity to network, again, establish those connections, which helped me move into subsequent roles once I was done with the fellowship program. So I definitely recommend it. I know it's not for everybody. Not everybody can take that break and a step back, and for financial, family reasons. But there are a number of similar opportunities, some shorter, through different companies and universities. So it's worth exploring further.
That sounds like a great comprehensive experience that can lead to a job, certainly. And Michelle, since you offered some of those fellowship programs in regulatory affairs, do you want to add anything to that about those programs?
Sure. Regulatory affairs is a really unique beast and niche entity. When you're looking at pharmaceutical companies and CROs, regulatory for me is quite thrilling. I think there's something thrilling about reading global regulations. Don't judge me. And you know, because I think at one point during my PhD training, I always thought about basic science is really amazing, but how can I better the world? How can this be really something that can help the world? And at a certain point, I honestly thought about law school. I had several friends that finished PhDs. They were working on intellectual property, tech transfer, but I fell into regulatory, which was kind of the direction I wanted to go. But how did I get there? Because you see either positions that are constantly being advertised for as a director, associate director, manager, 8 years experience, 5 years experience. We want FDA, ECTD, ECTD submission. We want this type of experience. Have you presented in front of the FDA? And I don't have any of that. I have none of that. So one thing to look for is an entry-level regulatory position. There are several here within the RTP area. I know Roe offers an integrated product development associate position, which is an entry-level position for regulatory and clinical. Impact Pharmaceuticals, which is now Synergy, also offers what is called a clinical writing fellowship, which is the submission of regulatory. Those kind of go hand in hand. In my case, I looked for an internship, and what I did was I had to look hard for an internship. While you're finishing your advanced degree, and I know I talked to a lot of my friends through network, and they said, oh, while I was doing my PhD, I was able to get an internship with this company, et cetera. And I already had my PhD, I was already working, and that opportunity was not available to me because I'm not a student. So I really had to work hard to find an internship opportunity that was entry level, knowing that I didn't have any experience. And it just wasn't me. There was a couple of my other friends that wanted to make that transition as well, out of science into regulatory. So they took entry-level positions, temporary positions for 3 to 6 months. They transitioned into a permanent position, and from there now they're building on their careers. And so you really have to look for those within the Fortune 500 companies of the large CROs. Locally, you can look for some of the smaller companies that may or may not offer that. But while I was doing that, I took every opportunity that I could to learn more about regulatory affairs. Duke, ORAC, Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality, offers a twice a year regulatory learning program. You have to register for that. You have to go to the meetings. They're all online, and there are some tests required with it, but it's an entry-level position or entry-level training into what you may or may not encounter in regulatory and product development. I know that NCRAF, which is an organization that I belong to, the North Carolina Regulatory Affairs Forum, offers a yearly program for those people that want to take the RAC exam. To take the RAC exam, you must be employed because you do need a sponsor that will support you for that. And but I just took those classes because I wanted to know more about it. And I was able to meet a lot of people through that gave me some guidance. But then I got all this great training material as well too. So it really is a hunt game to figure out where to apply, how to apply, and where you will fit.
Mhm. Yeah, those are great points, Michelle. And I can say on my end, I knew when I finished my PhD that I wanted an administrative position. So I was looking more towards, administration and research operations. And when I finished my doctorate, I really kind of thought that I was going to be maybe work in a lab or a faculty member, but as time went on, I knew that I didn't want to do that. And I ended up talking to someone in career services at the university where I finished. I got my doctorate at UNC Greensboro. And she had me sort of do this little exercise where I wrote a column of the qualities that I wanted in my ideal job, and then another column of the qualities, the skills that I was good at, and kind of match those up. And that was really the first time that I went, oh, I have administrative skills, and it really changed my life. That's when I really knew that that's what I wanted to do. So I ended up moving to California not too long after that, and I got entry level for me with a PhD was a program manager position in an academic institution. Now I know some people, entry level is project manager, it could be project director, could be a CRC level. I think it just depends on what your experience is and what you really want. But for me, that was the level that worked for me. So Mac, do you want to talk about, kind of your entry into medical writing and what that looked like?
Yeah, it was, so actually during my postdoc, I got a master's in clinical and population translational sciences. And that really sort of introduced me on, I guess, more on a theoretical level to human research. Like we had classes like epidemiology, and we had a lot of statistics and clinical trials. And so that was really sort of my first exposure, and at the time I was doing my postdoc, I was starting to work more with in the human realm, not so much bacteria anymore, went right to, sort of humans. So that was sort of, my first look in getting into, thinking of the human the human disease issues, and it was much more of a facing, I guess, than as abstract as something, like in a lab in a dish. And I think that maybe could have helped a bit with me transitioning in. I think at one point I may have been the only person doing chicken motor neuron stress response in the world, so I'm not sure, but maybe. But that's not real translatable into the human side. So after my postdoc, then I started to do some preclinical testing work, and we wrote protocols for those, and that got me introduced to writing more. I did do some sort of contract work with editing and things like that. And it really was sort of a find what you can sort of situation. I really didn't qualify for anything. I mean, at all. I mean, I'll just be frank. So I think, the one after those experiences where we did preclinical testing and I got some protocol writing experience, even though it wasn't human, it was still study protocols. And, they weren't way off from what I do now. I mean, there's certainly a lot more things we put in these protocols, but from an experimental standpoint, you still, have a study calendar and things like that. You still describing the problem. It's just on a different, in a different space. And I think that probably helped a bit. And of course, we write grants that fail often, and things like that. So I had plenty of grant writing experience. And I think that sort of helped get me into that first position. But, all that other time before, you're really writing for yourself, right? You're not writing for someone else. And that's a very different sort of situation. But I'm pretty sure I probably wouldn't have gotten that opportunity otherwise. I mean, without that experience. So it's one of those things where, at the time you sort of wonder how would this ever happen? And then in retrospect, you kind of think, well, maybe I should have trusted my path a little more. But at the time, I was not.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You touched on something too that I think is important to point out, which is beyond a certain point, once you, with an advanced degree, I think beyond a certain point, a lot of these jobs are administrative. And it's whether you that's what you want to do, and if you have those skills. I think that's something important to consider. Do you have administrative skills, and is that something you want to do? I know a couple people at Duke who have PhDs, and they're in senior CRC positions and have been there for a long time because that's what they really love. They love working with patients, and they love, the mechanics of that job, and didn't really want to move up. So that's something to consider as well, for people on the call.
Yeah, and I just want to add one extra bit is that, in that process of us going through and getting our degrees and going through our postdocs, we accumulate a lot of skills. I mean, we just don't direct them outward as much, I think. I mean, that may sound strange, or maybe I'm not putting that quite like I should, but it really is just sort of for your career development. You think about it sort of internal, but you don't always realize that you can really help other people with these skills as well.
Yeah,
I think during graduate school, I heard a lot, especially when I was taking my qualifying exams, because we had to take at Ohio State, you had to take an exam through all the divisions and then be awarded a points. You needed 5 points to move on to the next step. So during those exams, which were always the third Saturday of every month, because that always conflicted with the Ohio State-Michigan game, we heard a lot about, like, all the time, we heard a lot about we're testing your breadth during these. And when you're working on your PhD subject matter, you're going to be a subject matter expert on the depth, which is very true. I mean, I am a subject matter expert on the discoid domain receptor protein and multiforms 1 and 2, definitely. But now I'm working on that breadth in which I'm taking all those skills and kind of expanding out from that. So it's the same, definitely that concept that was driven home to us.
yeah, that's a good point. Oh, go ahead, Paulina.
Oh, I just wanted to add, just as a reminder, try to then market some of those skills for the specific positions that you're applying for. Same with me. I only had one position within industry where my pharmacy licensure was actually required, where I had to be a licensed pharmacist in the state of Texas for our phase 1 clinic. Otherwise, I haven't needed my licensure, but I'm still using the skills. So for pharmacy, similar to, for example, a career for those who have a PhD, there are certain skills that you acquire along the way that you can use for positions, whether it's an ability to read primary literature and take data and draw insights from that data, how to conduct literature searches, how to, as Max said, how to write or present on data. And those are skills that are directly transferable to a number of positions within industry, whether it's medical writing or regulatory affairs or feasibility, for example, in my case. So just something to think about and try to maybe write out those skills. And as Holly said, the things that you're good at, and see how you can align them with the requirements listed for specific positions.
And I can offer too, I might be an anomaly in this group, but I consider myself more of a generalist. And I've actually been in jobs where I've had to do a breadth of skills. The job that I held previously was called a research program leader at Duke in the office that I mentioned before, which is the Office of Clinical Research. And the model for that office is that your time gets contracted out to various departments at Duke. So you're sort of a little bit of an internal consultant. So I might have 6 contracts with different departments at Duke at one time, and they're all different things. So a lot of it was administering large grants, project management, strategic planning, writing manuscripts. So it was a lot of different things across the job, and I actually like the variety. So there are jobs like that out there as well that are not so specialized. So that's another point to make as well. So let's switch gears just a little bit and maybe talk about what your average day looks like. So Mac, do you want to kind of talk a bit first about what your average work day looks like?
Yeah. So it's changed a bit recently, but when I was writing a lot more, you basically would make a list of your documents you need to work on, and look at timelines, look at the other things we think about with like funding, whose funding is, who's knocking on your door because they have a just-in-time notification that needs to be addressed. And so it's really just sort of going through that process and seeing what needs to get done, interacting a lot with investigators, to make sure I'm understanding what they're looking for and getting it in their documents. And not only that, but interacting with study staff, with regulatory, seeing where projects are. I mean, it's not, I guess, at some level, it is, putting together some documents, but then it's also, making sure everything else is running together too, coordinating. One of the things about, some of those preclinical studies that I was working on is I was coordinating a team, and that helps with what I was doing as I was writing, because you have statisticians that need to be involved, you have the PIs or co-investigators or that need to be involved. You may have data managers, like forms development needs to be involved, and all that kind of needs to be coordinated, all moving toward, committee approval, or submission and approval, or toward FDA, depending on, the situation. So there's a lot of that, a lot more interactions than you might think for someone who's writing, a lot more person-to-person interactions. And now it's much more of the coordinating aspect. So I'm still getting used to this new position, but now I'm in the position now where I'm sort of assisting other writers, get get their projects completed when they need me. I mean, they're great. So, and working on things to develop extra clinical trials projects and things like that.
So you're in clinical development, and that means you assist medical writers and assist with getting clinical trials off the ground and developing protocols. Is that correct?
Yeah, we mainly help develop the protocols. We will write consent documents Depending on where you go, and I will say this: writing positions are a really big umbrella. You could have anything from someone who's mainly an editor to someone who's a regulatory writer, writing up INDs and doing IND submissions. You can have someone like me who was a protocol writer or a grant writer, or someone who ghost writes. It's a huge umbrella. And so one of the challenges I've had, and I'm sorry, this is not sort of my typical day, but one of the things that I really had to hone in on was, what's that position that I'm applying for look like, really? So what I do didn't always translate to other positions, but so as far as what we do from a clinical development standpoint is we do help develop those protocols, the IND applications, consent documents. We will help write, sometimes help with manuscripts. We will help with investigators' brochure development. We pretty much help wherever we can, mainly protocols though.
Okay, and what would be kind of an entry-level job? What would be the job title, or what would that look like for an entry level into medical writing?
Yeah, I think it will probably depend a little bit on the institution and the focus. My first position was a clinical protocol and grant writer, and that was what it was called. There was really nowhere else to go. That was sort of it. Now at UNC, we have a clinical protocol development associate, and then a senior level a person in that position. So it might look pretty variable. You may have like a junior level type sort of situation, or it might just be fairly nondescript and just be a medical writer entry level.
Okay, thank you. And so, Michelle, would you talk just a little bit about what an entry-level position might look like for regulatory, and then talk a little bit about what your average work day looks like?
Sure. Well, the first thing is my commute, because I work from home, and the commute from the bedroom to the kitchen to the office is killer. Seriously. There's some drawbacks to working at home, but now there's some drawbacks to working in the office too. So one of the positions within regulatory, there's three sort of branches of regulatory, and Mac touched on one of those, regulatory writing, in which you're actually developing informed consents, maybe some protocol writing for some of the country submissions. Maybe you'll receive the IMPD, which is a product development document, in which you need to make a quality of summary, and that's where my chemistry background comes in. In regulatory, there's the other two areas are either regulatory operations and regulatory strategy. So my focus is more on gaining more experience and working with regulatory strategy, in which I can go back to my client, the sponsor, and say, I know that your team wants to submit to Health Canada at the first of the year, and the Canadian Health Canada Canadian agency will be open. However, we need these documents in place. Once those documents are in place, here's a review cycle. If there's an issue, I need to send it back. You need to correct it. Here's my timeline of doing that. So for you to start a clinical trial in January in Canada may or may not happen. Health regulatory operations is more of documenting the communications between regulatory authorities, documenting submissions, making sure those submissions are done properly with the global organization that you're dealing with, so it doesn't get kicked back and it's more efficient and you're saving your client money. So right now I'm kind of doing a little bit of both. I do know that there is a need for regulatory operations positions. I don't necessarily know if those positions would lead to anything in strategy. So regulatory operations, you would hear something like document specialist as another prime example. Regulatory strategy is, for me, much more exciting because you are working with these global agencies in my case. So my typical day is I will look, I have a lot of clients that are in different time zones, particularly in China, the UK. I have one out of France right now. And so I'll wake up in the morning and I'll have a slew of emails from them. And it will talk about anything from right now, clinical documents, such as making sure that the informed consent does have and completed the checklist as per regulatory standards, because we do have a standard operating procedure for regulatory standards. There's a protocol check that's involved with that. And then there's several documents in itself that need to be addressed when you're performing a clinical trial in different countries. And you have to make sure that the client is aware of those documents, who's on the document, and if this document is sufficient enough to be submitted for those clinical trial sites. So it's a lot of different things that are going on. And then most recently, there were some issues in which we have a client that had used a previous CRO. They weren't happy, they left, they went to our company, and they're missing a whole bunch of documents. Okay, well, that's fine, but one of those documents that's missing could be one that may or may not be used in what's called a pregnant partner, which means that this person's not even involved in the clinical trial, but yet they've signed an informed consent form, and that's pretty bad. So you have to make sure that the sponsor is doing something, because the bottom line is we want to make sure that participants in this clinical trial are safe and healthy, and the health of the patient always comes first. So.
Yep, thank you. And do most regulatory, sort of entry-level regulatory positions at this point, do they involve global or domestic or both, or it depends on the position?
It depends on the position. You know, it definitely depends on the position. You'll talk to some people and they'll say, "Oh, global is much more exciting." But then when you read the trade magazines of who's hiring, everybody wants FDA submission. Well, there's a reason for that. And so, you know, the goal for me is always to gain more experience. So that's why I'm always going to my line manager and saying, "Hey, I'd like more experience doing this," or "I would like to be involved in this submission," or "I would like to do this." So most recently, I submitted to Canada, the Health Canada regulatory agency, and then I got a new client and they're like, "Okay, well, we have a submission through the UK." And what was crazy about that submission was I had never done one before, and it was kind of initiation by fire, because they had made changes in the protocol, they had made changes in their informed consent form, and they said, "Oh, this is a non-substantial amendment." Well, then I had to go back and say, well, the Health Regulatory Authority does not accept a substantial amendment. So I would recommend this, this, and this. And then when it came down to it, I actually had to call 2 people in the UK to help me walk me through the process. Because when our submission packages are here done in the States, we hand it off to someone else. And I couldn't find one here in the States, anyone in the States to help me make this submission for the client. And in the end, the submission was done. I did it correctly. The ethics committee was informed. And I'm like, wow. I mean, I can't believe I did that. And so, I mean, it's just a whole bunch of different things that you're dealing with, because you're dealing with people from other countries, you're dealing with people here in the United States. And one thing that I always prided myself on when I was in graduate school was how well that I could communicate. And then I took this job and realized that communicating in the corporate world is much different than communicating in the academic world.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. Yeah, but you make a good point too, to take initiative and ask for help if you need it as well. Those are,
I mean, that was a whole day of phone calls. And then I have to bill out to my client, and I'm like, who do I bill this to? You know?
So Paulina, would you mind talking a little bit about maybe entry-level positions for Pharm Ds, what that might look like, and your typical day?
Yeah, so typical day, that's a good question. I think something that I like about this position is that there's every day is a little different. Every day has its curveball, but I'll start with just taking a brief step back and talking a little bit more about my current position, because business information, when you hear that, I don't know if it means the same thing or even means anything in particular to anyone. So my role in my group is involved in performance metrics specifically. So we look at data for the clinical development services division, basically the group within the company that deals with clinical trial execution end to end. And we look at how do we measure success, and how do we know that we're performing well in our clinical trials. So our group is a mix of individuals, both with a data analytics background and individuals with operational experience. So we have individuals that know what data to pull, how to extract data, how to manipulate it, and then draw initial insights. And then we have individuals with operational background experience, such as myself, to help then discuss with the various groups within the company that are responsible for those day-to-day operations. How are we doing? How are you doing? And if there are areas of underperformance, what can we be doing to improve it? And then kind of feed that back to reevaluate. Are we even measuring the right thing? How, as a company, are we performing against industry benchmarks? We do have industry benchmarks for how certain parts of the clinical trial should be executed, and what time, with what success, looking at adverse events as well. And then how are we doing internally against the expectations of our clients? So my day-to-day role is anything from taking those insights and then developing, whether it's report generation or speaking with, now for me, my clients are internal. So these various business units that conduct the clinical trial within our company, to talk about how different groups are performing, what are their needs in terms of metrics, and how can we facilitate performance improvement as well. I work remotely, so I'm actually based in northern New Mexico. So I'm not, the closest office is in Austin, so I don't get to go into the office very frequently. So that's, I think, another consideration as we've worked towards a more remote workforce due to the pandemic. What is your personality? A lot of companies are now offering a hybrid approach or a fully remote work environment. So maybe think about whether you'd like to be close to an office and have that opportunity to split your time, because as much as video conferences have helped, it's still not the same as being able to see individuals face to face. In terms of entry-level positions for Pharm Ds, I think that can vary greatly depending on the background that you have in terms of work experience and how you can, again, translate those skills. directly prior to this position, I worked in feasibility, strategic feasibility within PPD. I think that terminology is pretty similar across industry, something with feasibility, whether it's feasibility manager, feasibility, maybe site liaison. And that is a great career opportunity for PharmDs because you can translate your experience with your clinical knowledge. So you can evaluate a clinical protocol, assess what the disease state is, the indication, what the mechanism of action is of a specific drug under development, and how that fits into the broader development landscape, and how attractive that drug might be to patients and to prescribers. So the feasibility, typically, when you hear something regarding a feasibility position, that role is focused on the front end of a clinical trial where you're trying to evaluate which countries a study should be run in, which sites have the ideal site profile, and what investigators should be selected for a particular clinical trial based on indication, disease state, and the specific drug in question. But I've honestly met PharmDs in a wide range of roles. There are also entry-level medical writing positions where I've seen PharmDs, also MSL positions as well. Again, going back to that medical knowledge and the ability to communicate medical information.
Yep, that's great, Paulina. Thank you.
So Holly, this is Vivian. We have some questions that are coming up and some of them are getting answered. So I would just, if it's okay with you, maybe spend 10 minutes on questions and then go back to the panel. So Michelle, thank you. Michelle has already answered some questions on the RAP certification course. So I think most people see that response. And she's also provided some good resources on regulatory training. A question for Paulina has come up and it says, what would you recommend for a Pharm D who has been in community practice for 10 plus years and is looking to transition to drug safety / pharmacovigilance in industry, knowing it would be very difficult to compete for a fellowship with recent grads? Do you think a certification or graduate degree will be useful or necessary?
That's a great question. I think that my initial recommendation would be, again, to try to become involved in some of the industry organizations that exist to develop those connections and speak to somebody within medical communication or medical affairs that is in the role currently to better learn what type of experience might be necessary, and if there are any positions that are already listed that are being recruited for, see what some of those basic requirements are. I don't personally know of what type of specific certifications are available in this space. So searching to see if there is something available that might help kind of help specialize that skill set.
Okay, thank you. And one for Holly. And the question was the break you had taken in your career, did the break you took in your career become a hurdle for you when you started to look for jobs? And if so, how did you overcome it during the application and interviewing process?
It was a hurdle initially. It honestly took me a little. I was out for about a year caring for parents. And it took me, I would say, 5 or 6 months to find a job once I started looking. And I applied for quite a few and didn't hear back from quite a few. I would say it did take a while, and that was where the temporary service actually came in handy for me. I didn't know about it at first, and someone mentioned it to me, and And as I said previously, I applied for that, didn't hear anything initially. And I think within a few weeks, I got 2 jobs right pretty quickly, and they both were short term, but they got me in the door. And I started something else to keep in mind, if you're going back in the workforce like that, you might consider taking something that's not your dream job right away to get in the door. You might need to take a job for a little while that's a stepping stone. And I thought that I was going to be able to go right back into the type of job and the level of job that I had before. And I actually took something that was probably a step down and ended up kind of working back up, but it didn't take long. It only took me maybe 6 months to work back up and then move up again. So I would say it was just persistence, and keep applying, be persistent, don't give up. That's probably my best advice, and use whatever avenues are available to you. Don't eliminate anything because you think it might not be relevant. You never know where something's going to come from.
Holly, I think you raised a really good point, but I do want to comment on this. We have PhDs, we have advanced degrees, Pharm Ds, PhDs, and I remember when I was making this career transition, a lot of my friends would send me job announcements, and I was very gracious, but those job announcements were for $17 an hour as a lab technician, and no HR is going to hire me with a PhD and postdoc experience for a lab technician position just to get your foot in the door. And I remember thinking about that. And I just had a question that came up earlier saying you should dumb down your resume. Absolutely not, because you're lying to the company. I mean, and that's reasons for dismissal. And B, you're not going to be happy. Now, yeah, it does stink because you could probably do a customer service job for $15 an hour. But if HR knows you have a PhD, they're not going to consider you for that position because they want someone that's going to stay in that position. So I think it was really hard and bothersome. And I was applying for jobs, and I think I had applied for a job and they had wanted to hire me, but it wasn't anything near my skill set. And they wanted me to hire me for like 12 an hour or something like that. But at the time, I grew up in a restaurant and I went back to work in a restaurant, and literally I was making between $30 and $40 an hour. So why would I give that up to take a $12 an hour job that I'm not going to be happy with? I'm going to be miserable. I'm going to make my coworkers miserable. You've got this PhD, you've worked hard for it. Is it discouraging? Yes, I reached out to so many people in my support network, my professional network. I had people look at my resume. I had people go through interviewing skills with me. I had people just have coffee with me when I said, oh my God, I'm never going to get a job. And I was on the verge of tears, and I had always someone there. And I owe a lot of that. I tell this all the time. I owe a lot of that to the North Carolina Biotech Center, because that's where I started my networking journey in RTP. So I encourage anyone to reach out and stick with it.
So here's another general question, Holly. You can take it as you wish. It's a general question about getting their foot in the door via an internship. So maybe some specificity around that.
Does anyone on the panel want to take that?
Well, as a former intern, yeah, internships are great opportunities. I had finished, I knew nothing about clinical trials, so I took the Clinical Trial Research Associate program at Durham Tech, which offered an internship. And I got an internship at DCRI, and it was in their quality group. I didn't do anything in quality. It was right when the pandemic started. I was in the DCRI building maybe for like a month, and then everybody was work from home. And what I did is they asked me, the quality department asked me to design a quality management system so they could keep better track of their quality audits that needed to be performed within their particular clients. And I remember meeting with my boss, the person that was in charge of me, and she said, "Oh, you don't have to learn how to program, you just have to tell the programmers what you needed." This was during COVID, everything was shut down. So I felt, for me personally, I felt it was easier for me to teach myself Jira query language during a global pandemic so I could better communicate with my programming team. And then I think the internship was supposed to be like 3 months. And I was just like, I got nothing going on. Let's just extend this. So they had like free help for, gosh, about 6 or 7 months. And I remember thinking, oh, this is great. I'm going to get an internship. Well, remember, you're an intern, and I was an intern at Duke. I had all these great benefits, but one benefit I did not have was having access to the internal jobs network. I was still considered someone, an outsider, and I could not apply for positions in Duke. So that was a big bummer. The other thing is when after that experience and I was applying for positions, someone said, "Oh, how come you're not applying for quality positions?" And I'm like, "Well, because I haven't done quality, but it says quality right here." And I'm like, that was the department I was in. So I felt really fortunate. I hunted down an internship. I was able to get it. But in my internship group, there was a wide range. There was 2 people that were registered pharmacists. There was one person that was, I think, had a master's in public health. One person that had another master's degree. A couple other people that had bachelor's degrees. So there's a mix because you realize that these CROs in clinical trials need a mix of all the intelligence around them. And so for me, that internship didn't last very long, and I transitioned into an associate position quite quickly because that became available to me. But at no time during that position was I treated as an intern. So you have to keep that in mind.
So a question I think best addressed by Mac, it said, if someone only has grant writing experience from a PhD, how can they become equipped to enter a medical writing field?
I think you're equipped. Yeah, I do. I mean, I really do. I mean, I think, all that writing we do, I will say though, I understand where that's coming from, because I think by the time I was really, it hit home that I was going to be not in a lab in jeans and a t-shirt running experiments all day, that I was going to go out and do something else. I felt like I could do this stuff if someone just gave me a chance. And I think if you have grant writing experience, I think, as a PhD, I think probably the most difficult step from writing for yourself to writing to someone else is really putting in the effort to understand what they need. I think you're more than qualified. If you're doing it, you really just need a break to get in there. I think you're there, and I hope you get a break. And that's that's all. I think all of us probably at some level can't. I mean, at some point you need an advocate. I mean, you need someone who believes in you. You can do it. If you've written a grant, you could do it for someone else. It's just, that next step is really just, learning that ability to take someone else's work and give them what they need back.
Mhm.
Right. Next question is, one of the audience members would like to pivot from drug safety role to clinical project assistant role. How do they go about this?
I will say I don't know what that position is. I mean, they can vary, and I'm sorry, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying sometimes it may be something I know, but I don't know it by that position term, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the individuals went on to say the reason for their pivot is that they don't have a medical degree, so don't believe that they can climb, but they do have a master's degree in clinical project management, but no internship. So they've got some experience and now they're trying to pivot.
My response would be if they have experience in drug safety, they're probably already working for a CRO. And then that's just a matter of tapping into your and speaking with your line manager to say, I'd like to pivot areas into this area. Is there a position available? And apply internally. All these companies want to keep their workers happy, and they want to keep them within the company. So that being said, that's why there's such a huge encouragement of applying within the company. Now I could be wrong because I saw that question as well, but that would be something that I would continue to pursue. Is if you're already doing drug safety in a CRO capacity, continue to do something else within the CRO, because once you're in, you can pivot within your own company, you can pivot to other companies, you could pivot to something else, and the world is your oyster at that point.
And I just wanted to
Thank you, Paulina.
add, Vivian, to what Michelle was saying, and of course, assuming that those opportunities exist within the same company, but hopefully the company is encouraging an environment for that type of internal mobility and lateral moves. And again, especially coming from my standpoint as a line manager, I do really value those types of candid conversations and to see where individuals' interests lie, because oftentimes, especially as you're trying to get your foot in the door within industry in the first place, you start doing a job and then you realize this is really not for me. Great experience, but okay, I mean, I need to move on. So please have those types of conversations with your line manager to help facilitate internal career moves.
So we have another question, and it's an add-on from your responses, and they want to know, by advocate, do you need someone inside the organization to help or refer?
Yeah, partly. I think, yeah, I mean, I think partly that is it. I mean, at least in my experience, I kind of, you go in, I mean, we all go in and we work hard and we do our best. And I think sometimes, I mean, you may not necessarily feel appreciated, but when you find that person that does, they will elevate you. And not only that, if that person might be there if you're not, with an organization, and they say, yeah, if you're, I mean, I've had references, I mean, all my references going into my first position in clinical research were all basic science folks. I didn't have anybody in the clinical realm to give me any references, but those other references could say, oh yeah, he could do that, I mean, so yeah, I think you need that on some level. It could be either internal or external. I don't know what everyone else's experiences are with that, but
yeah. And I would encourage, as you kind of go through your careers and develop those types of relationships, to keep up with those relationships and periodically set up calls and see how are things going? How are you? How's your career? I mean, and talk through those. So even if it's somebody who isn't within the industry, but those connections matter, and upholding kind of those relationships makes an impact. I will say that throughout my career, it's been extremely helpful to identify a mentor, whether it's somebody that you've worked for or with in the past that has specific qualities that you admire, but reach out to that person and say, this is kind of where I'd like to get in my career. These are some of the things I'm trying to improve on. Can you help me? Can we stay connected? And I've found those types of conversations, again, it's always a very safe space. You can finally be very honest about kind of what your needs are, where you think you're lacking, maybe even have that person, for example, review your resume or review a presentation that you did if you're trying to work on your presentation skills. So definitely try to develop relationships, whether it's internally within your company or externally through past experiences.
So the next question is for Mac. Do you feel there is a promotion ceiling in clinical research for PhDs that have a background in basic science? Is it possible to be stuck in the research associate position for a long time? Some people told me that doing research associate is not using my PhD degree.
So I don't know if there's a ceiling. I mean, I've worked with people with PhDs in positions I didn't even know about. And I thought they were amazing. In fact, I'll say that at one point I was interacting with one person, and I did think they were a clinician scientist, but they weren't at all. They were a PhD. They had a PhD, and I don't know this. I may not be great at answering that question from an academic standpoint, because in academic science, in clinician, there are a lot of clinicians in these higher up roles. Now in industry, it's probably a bit different. I feel like there's probably a bit of there's a little bit of a difference between industry and academics, but I think if you find the right environment in academics, you can move up just fine.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it partially depends on what your skill set is too.
Yes.
I think it harkens back to our previous conversation about once you get beyond a certain level, it's administrative. So, do you have those skills? Is that what you really want?
Yeah, there's always a ceiling somewhere. But I think you can certainly move up. You can move up if you can find the opportunities. It's there.
And there are jobs. I'm sorry, Paulina. I was just going to say real quickly, there are jobs at Duke, and I don't remember the job title, where it's a scientific administrative position where you are, you are doing something administrative, but you're also designing studies. So, there is that combination does exist. So, sorry, Paulina, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add that if you look at different companies, including Thermo Fisher, a lot of the executives have PhDs, but you're starting to move to an area of obviously management. So it just depends on what type of role you're looking for. But definitely, sky's the limit.
Yeah.
Here's another, it's a very general question, but it's a good one. While our experience is definitely transferable, how can that be explicitly conveyed in a resume? It seems like very unique language is being filtered by HR systems.
Yeah. Does anybody want to take that?
I don't know. I'll say, boy, I don't know. So when I was coming out, I think one of the recommendations I heard at one time was to have a couple resumes, to highlight, certain skill sets. And think that's probably a pretty good idea.
Yeah. Something else that I can suggest that I have done too, and it might be easier to do this on an academic website, but if the job description tells you kind of what department it's in, or what center or institute it's in, you can kind of deduce who might be hiring for that job or who is in charge of that. And you might consider sending that to them directly. And maybe I shouldn't say that out loud, but that's but I know that I have done that in the past to make sure my resume gets there. Because a lot of companies, filter based on keywords. And if you don't have those keywords, you don't know if your resume gets to the department or not. No.
So we
Yeah,
have,
and I don't,
go
I
ahead.
just wanted to say, Vivian, that and as you're revamping your resume for a specific position, try to include some of those keywords that you see on the job posting as well. So that's something that I've heard. I haven't had hands-on experience to see how well that works, but just a thought.
It's a good one. Last question, specific for Michelle, and I think they wanted some clarification. Did you say that you started out doing a certificate program and internship at Durham Tech, but that internship wasn't helpful and you eventually had to do an associate's degree? I think there was some. Yeah.
Oh, no,
some
no.
confusion.
Yeah, let me clarify that. No. So Durham Tech has a clinical trials research associate program, and part of that training is an internship. I was offered an internship at Duke, DCRI, Duke Clinical Research Institute, in their quality department. So the internship was good, and I'm not negatively saying that. The only negative was the fact that I was an intern and I wasn't able to access the internal application system for job applications. And I knew I didn't want to do quality. So then I looked really hard for an internship opportunity, which I finally got at IQVIA, and the internship was entry level, great benefits, okay pay. I mean, but I knew that position was not going to be very long, so it was only a short amount of time before I was offered an associate's position. So in regulatory at IQVIA, you go to like intern or associate, to specialist, to senior specialist, and then to manager position. So that is the role progression that goes forward in my current company.
So we are close to being out of time. So maybe just final thoughts, Holly, or the panel?
I think this has been great. So Mac, any final comments, anything that you can think of that we haven't talked about?
Well, no, I would just say, as you're going through this process, I mean, trust your path. There is room for us types in clinical research, and there's room for us all to grow. I mean, look, I'm now directing, clinical development, and started off as a writer. There's room to move, and there's room for us, and I would just stick at it, like Michelle said.
Yeah,
Great.
this is making that career transition is really scary. I always think of Indiana Jones. Is it the last one? I can't think of the last one where, the Holy Grail or whatever. And he's at that point where he takes a leap of faith. And it's very trying, and you're going to have difficult times. The biggest thing for me during that time was the anxiety. I mean, I really struggled with anxiety during that time, and so I reached out to some professional counseling, which got my head back on straight when I'd have a bad interview and I'd have the voices in my head along with all the other voices in my head. I really needed to compartmentalize those. So I wish I could say that there's here's your golden ticket and here's the answer to getting your foot in the door, but there is no such golden ticket for them. But reach out to people. I really relied on my network to help me go through my resume, my interviewing skills. I kept running into people I knew at networking events. I reached out to a number of people to ask them to be a mentor to me. And plus, I grew up in a restaurant, so I was working in a bar and a restaurant, and I cannot tell you, I'd keep business cards in my book, and I'd have conversations with people, and I'd give them the business card and find out that there's some CEO of some company, and then we have a frank conversation about things. And it's you just have to be incredibly proactive on this journey. So the positive thing was I had the financial means to make this transition, but yeah, because I worked in a bar and a restaurant, which was a plus.
So I want to do a huge thank you to the moderator, the panelists, and all of you for joining us tonight. For more information about careers in clinical research in the North Carolina CROs, please visit ncbiotech.org/CRO. And I did put that in the Q&A earlier. Please keep an eye on your email and our events calendar to register for our next conversation. We hope to see you then. Have a great night. The video of this recording of this event will be available on our website along with the slides that you saw earlier. And that will be located again at ncbiotech.org/CRO. Thank you and have a good night.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.